Welcome to the Nahrein network. Today we're with René Teijgeler from Netherlands, a friend and a colleague who has worked in Iraq in the early years of 2004. René has a background in book conservation, book binding, degrees in anthropology and sociology, social psychology. Hello, René. How are you today?
Thank you. I'm fine.
Why did you go to Iraq in the first place?
Well, it started actually with me joining the CIMIC unit in the Dutch Army. CIMIC is the Civil Affairs unit in the Army. I was in a conference and here in the Netherlands, and the commander of the unit approached me after I gave a lecture if I wouldn't like to join the CIMIC unit. I have a bit of a leftist background, being protesting against the army in general, actually. I didn't join the army when I had to, and it was still in the times of inscription. So all the same, I started a discussion with him, and it looked to me that the CIMIC unit was a really fair unit. And if you want to change something, or at least contribute something, from my perspective, as an heritage expert, you might as well do it during the war. Now, many other people are working during the war, a lot of NGOs, civil servants, but we were always absent, we meaning heritage experts. We were trying to do something before a conflict started, but actually mainly we were concentrating on post-conflict periods. And I thought, this is ridiculous. Why don't we do something during a conflict? And then the unit, the CIMIC unit, seemed very well prepared. It was the first unit. It was sort of a breakthrough in the Dutch army. And I decided to join it. I became an officer. And I must admit that the first time I was shooting a gun, or a pistol, it sort of hit me. It wasn't easy to be introduced to such kind of violence. But it was sort of part of the deal. And actually, before I knew it, they wanted me to go to Iraq as a senior advisor for the Ministry of Culture in Baghdad, attached to the American Embassy. So I met my predecessor, Zainab Bahrani, on a conference in Istanbul. And I decided to take on the job because I thought that I could contribute something during a conflict in safeguarding a cultural heritage of such an important country as in Iraq.
And this was the Iraqi Reconstruction Management Office, which was part of the US Embassy.
It was, yes.
And what was its role specifically?
Well, it was the follow-up of the CPA, the Coalition Provision Authority. Actually, it sounds very arrogant, but everybody knows that the US was running the country. They took over the entire administration of Iraq, all the political institutions, including the main mistakes everybody knows today, is firing or dissolving the army and dissolving the Ba'ath Party and firing everybody who was a member of the Ba'ath Party, including all civil servants at the ministries, etc. So within the CPA, they started with sort of a government, but the people in that provisional government only could be there when Bremer, the ambassador at the time of the US Embassy, was approving these positions. Then in Irmo, the government, the Iraqi government, was a little bit had a little bit more power, And every ministry within the RMO at the embassy, because we were part of the embassy of the United States, every ministry had a senior advisor, and I was the one for the Ministry of Culture.
What was the role of the senior advisors?
But that wasn't quite clear. You sort of fill it in yourself. So I made a plan, but the plan didn't really get approved or anything. Nobody did anything with that, because I wanted an advisor for archaeological site. I wanted an advisor for the museums. I wanted an advisor for the library and archives, etc. Somebody who would run the finances. That never went through. So I was there all by myself with an Iraqi secretary, and that was it.
So before we get into your role as a senior advisor for the Ministry of Culture at the Iraqi Reconstruction Management Office, could you tell us a bit about the background, the environment in which you were working in? I mean, this is post-invasion, so the early years. We're speaking here about the summer of 2004.
Yes, that's correct.
And so I guess that period was one or
well, it was a period when how should I say, the war more or less started. I mean, you had the invasion with the Americans, the UK, and they prefer to call the coalition parties, which there was already much to do about it, because it was a preemptive war under the leadership of UK and US. And only afterwards the UN approved the war. So because of the two horrible measures Bremer took, a lot of people started getting irritated with the occupation, meaning that more and more people protested, and not only the Sunnis because they were out of power, but also Shiite people. You had the Battle of Najaf, Nazaria, and of course Tigriti, etc., Fallujah. So I was in the middle of the war, and I had a very high position. My military rank was a major, but my actual rank was equivalent to a 2-star general. And I took part in the daily early morning meetings where all the senior advisors were present, together with the deputy chief of mission. And I had my own, well, when I went out, I had, a protection unit. Sometimes it was a private unit from Dynacorp or from Blackwater, or it was a military unit. I could not get out without protection. In the end, it looked like I was on a list to be killed, just like many other VIPs. So the protection was necessary.
This is an insurgency at the time. There was a growing insurgency.
Yeah, well, using the word insurgent, I ran into a conflict, or at least a discussion with a French colleague of mine, who said you shouldn't use that word because who is the terrorist in Iraq? And in the end, I think I agreed with him. But at least there were parties, non-government parties, using violence, so violent groups. But there were several of them, of course. Yeah, and then there was one thing that was interesting, because I was not American. And there were not that many foreigners at the US Embassy who had similar kind of positions. The British were the senior consultants or the senior advisors for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, State Department. Some of them were military, some of them were non-military. But of course, 90% were Americans. My position as a Dutchman made that I was not really that interesting for the US staff. I I was more or less fully supported by the Dutch military command. Well, maybe I should rephrase it. They didn't pay much attention for me being there. Although I met the Dutch ambassador and he knew I was there, and I met the Dutch commander of the Dutch troops in the south. He knew I was there. I knew that there were one or two people of Dutch intelligence, military intelligence, watching me, but there were never problems, so that was okay. Next to it, nobody was interested in culture.
Well, they were to a point after the Iraq Museum was looted or allowed to be looted.
Well, I had good contacts with the PR section. For them, it was more like it would damage the reputation of the United States and the U.S. troops in Iraq. I had actually a discussion at one point, and I think it was on an event when the coalition troops, the American troops mainly, were entering Najaf, or was it Nazariya, where the main shrine of Imam Ali is?
Yeah,
Najaf, right. And there were pictures published on American boots walking on the graveyards. Now, the graveyards I knew were very important because there's a lot of Shiite people from all over the world were buried there as close as possible to the tomb of Imam Ali. So there you have these American boots walking on the graves. I said, you cannot do that. And this was in the morning meeting with the ambassador. And we had a sort of a heated discussion on that. And he felt insulted, more or less, at least definitely irritated, because I brought up the subject and wouldn't let go. He said, I have experience in the Middle East, etc. I said, well, that is fine, but still you have a problem there. And I told him, if you want war and if you want to last the war longer, then you should, do these kind of things, because you're enticing the conflict, you're promoting the conflict by doing this. And he said, well, who needs culture? So that was the end of the discussion. Nobody really cared until, of course, the whole thing with Babylon blew up, and then later Sumatra, etc. And then it became a different story.
We'll get to those issues. When you say no one cared, you mean within the what became formal institutions, the U.S. occupation authorities, and the international organizations in Iraq?
No, it was the U.S. staff, including the three ambassadors. One of the ambassadors was my direct boss. He didn't bother with me anyway. He said, you're doing a good job, and that was it. So I was more or less completely independent. Then, of course, the role, or let's say, the power role of the Ministry of Culture within the provisional government was very little. Nobody cared. When a minister tried to get money to stop the looting or do anything on libraries or museums or archaeological sites to protect them, he just didn't get money.
Why was that the case?
Well, first of all, the Ministry of Culture did not have their own budget like the other ministries didn't. They were completely dependent on getting money from the Ministry of Finance, which is, of course, a very weak government structure. So they always had to ask for money at the Ministry of Finance. And they wanted to do things themselves, but they didn't have money, which is a very strange situation. Then we all knew that Bremer started actually, like Saddam did in the past. He chose people in the government, or he approved people in the government according to their religion or ethnic background. So we started this kind of division already. So within the government, I think it was at that time the Prime Minister Al-Awali, you had already conflicting interest of the different parties represented within the government. And the Ministry of Culture was led by the minister with a communist and Kurdish background. So that didn't help either. So the Ministry of Culture was within that structure, a weak ministry.
But we're speaking about the immediacy of the period of post-invasion, so 2003, 4, 5. But then, and this is before the elections of January 2005, national
No, they
elections.
were already, the elections of January.
But that period, this period you're speaking about, there wasn't any money in for any of the ministries.
No.
I mean, the money was locked. The international money was controlled by the U.S. Occupation Authority, by the U.S. Embassy. So none of the ministries had any money. I mean, they didn't.
Not that I know
salaries.
of. Well, you know, they applied for money, and the U.S. sometimes gave them money. Actually, the ministry was financed to some extent by the U.S. government. But of course, that was not enough. And again, as we probably know from our own countries, at least my country, you know, culture is at the bottom of any kind of government. The interim government, which was there when I worked in Baghdad, did have access to the oil for food program surplus funds. And it's called the Central Bank of Iraq Development Fund for Iraq, DFI. That is actually the proper name of the funds. Still, you had left, which was actually about 28 billion in the year after the invasion. So a lot of money. And they used to finance that for civil administration, humanitarian needs, and infrastructure repairs, etc. But the CPA, of course, the predecessor of the interim government, still had a lot to say on how to spend that money. And about the individual budgets, the ministers did have individual budgets, and some of them was financed by the US interim authorities at that time. The budget was very small and was only about actually renovating the ministries, meaning equipment, etc. So the Ministry of Culture did not have any budget for putting up projects or financing the INLA, the National Library and Archives. So all the funds for renovation, for example, the Iraqi Museum and the National Libraries and Archives, that were funds coming from outside sources, in the sense that not from the Ministry of Culture, because they simply did not have that money. They couldn't afford it. Another problem was, which I think I mentioned before too, is they not only had the money to fund projects, but it was also very difficult to receive money and give it directly to the Ministry of Culture. For example, I had the ideas of selling off the 4 heads of Saddam, which were on the rooftops of the palace in Baghdad, where the U.S. embassy was situated at that time. Because if I would have sold them off, the money would go to the Ministry of Finance. The same goes with all the material that was in the vault, which I had access to, and that needed to be, the vault was in the palace, and that needed to be returned to the proper authorities, Iraqi authorities. You know, the hundreds and maybe thousands of bottles of alcohol. Now, the first idea I had was selling them off. And then the minister said, yeah, well, you can do that, but then the funds have to go to the Ministry of Finance. I cannot receive that money. The same with all the cars we confiscate, or that were already confiscated, like the Rolls Royces from Hitler times. That one was worth over $1 million. And my idea was to put it on sale in the United States. But then again, the minister said, well, you know, then all the money would go to the Ministry of Finance. So there was only one thing for me left, is to return everything to the Ministry of Culture. In this case, was to Donny George and the SBAH. So everything was parked or transported to the Iraqi Museum, actually. Actually, it was so much that Donny George told me at one time, please, please stop giving me all those things. I have no storage for it anymore. Yeah.
And so, and then, what are your main priorities as a senior advisor for the Ministry of Culture? What were you working on specifically?
Well, the priorities came by practice. It depended on, what was going. I had to, of course, get acquainted with everybody. Actually, the Ministry of Culture didn't really like me, or at least I was the fourth or the fifth advisor after two Italian ambassadors and John Russell from the United States. So he wasn't really waiting for another advisor. And actually, he told me that. And so he was sort of, very aloof. And I thought, well, I'm not on vacation here. So if nobody wants me, I'll go home. So I went over to the minister. I said, the Dutch are very direct and very upfront. So please take that into consideration when I'm telling you that I want to know whether you want to work with me or not. Because this is not a vacation. It's a danger zone. And if you don't feel you want to work with me, then of course it's your right. But please tell me, then I'll pack my bags and go home. Well, then he laughed and he said, okay, tamam, let's work together. So that was the first hobble I had to take. So the first things that came to me, and especially also via Donny George, who was at that time already, I think, the DG, the General Director of this SBAH, the Antiquities Department. A lot of things from the possessions of Saddam were more or less bundled around or in the green zone. And to some extent also within the embassy, we had a room there, a vault actually, and I had the key to it. Later on, I noticed that the CIA was duplicating all kinds of documents within the vault, which I was supposed to have the only key to it, but that's a different story. So there were a lot of things that needed to go back to the museum, because I didn't know anybody else, to give the things to. So there were these famous carriages from Saddam. We transported them at night on a trolley in secret. There were cars, about 20 or 30 or probably even more cars, including a Rolls Royce that was given to the former king of Iraq by Hitler. A Mercedes-Benz, which must have been worth at least $1 million. I wanted to sell it, but then the money would go to the Ministry of Finance. So the minister said, no use. Cadillacs, pink Porsches. Actually, before that, the staff of the embassy was driving those kind of cars. So that was the thing. So we transported them again in secret to an underground garage near the town hall. And the mayor could drive in a white Mercedes that was an armored car as well. So those kind of things. And actually, well, there were all kinds of things. There was about thousands of bottles of spirits, alcohol. I couldn't get rid of it. And, so what are you supposed to do with it? Then the Americans came to me and they said, the Marines, he said, well, we can auction them off here at the embassy. And then we put the money into the orphanage fund. And I said, no, it's not, everything has to go back to the Iraqis. It's not our deal. It's not, it's not ours. So that was anything that people came to me that was from Saddam, in my honest opinion, should be returned, whatever it was, should be returned to the proper Iraqi authorities. And which was in practice actually the poor Donny George, because at one time at the museum, he said, René, how much more do you want to give me? I mean, this, I don't have any storage for it anymore. So, and of course, just one story. Of course, things were stolen.
Like what was stolen?
Well, there were. I got a message from the office of the Premier Al Alawi, I think, that there were 12 carpets, and I mean huge carpets, like 20 by 30 meters, Persian carpets, at the embassy, the former palace of Saddam, and he wanted them back. Well, what can I do? I should. What he does with it, it's not, it is not my responsibility. So I got hold of 2 or 3. The rest were gone. Then a member of the staff saw that I was collecting these carpets, and he said, well, I know a couple of more. And he said, the others, you have to go to Washington because the generals took them on the planes back home. They were plainly stolen. So I recovered probably 3 or 4, and I put them outside the embassy, outside the rooms, in order to transport them to the Premier's office the next day. And when I wanted to transport them, and the lorry was ready, the carpets were gone. Many things happen like this.
And of course, these are not, I mean, these were the property of the palaces and Saddam Hussein before 2003, but when you were there, they were the property of the state.
What do you mean? Which state?
The Iraqi state.
Yes, of course. In my opinion, it was, yes.
So it wasn't, I mean, you can't say that it was a property of an individual, which is what often is said, and then appropriate them on that basis.
No, I mean, no. Most of it was some kind of art or heritage. Of course, not the cars, although the old car, the Mercedes-Benz, definitely was heritage. But it was very clear, according to the antiquities law, the older one, I think. Well, anyway, everything found on Iraqi soil belongs to the state. Very simple. We had the same problem with the so-called Jewish archives, but that's a different story. So, whatever was found, whether it was Saddam or Uday, his son, or whatever, was not ours in the sense it was not the American, it was not Dutch, it was nothing of the coalition troops. It had to be returned to the Iraqis.
Do we know what happened to those items, those cultural objects in particular, or the collection that you saw or had keys to?
Well, many were stolen. I never knew what happened to the alcohol and the spirits. I turned over everything to a member of the staff of the embassy because I did not have a successor. So I let them sign for it, and in the end, that was very, very wise, because I could prove that it did not end up in the Netherlands, whatever. So yeah.
Before we get to speak about Babil, I mean, you worked with Donny George. So he was the director of the State Board of Antiquities and Heritage.
And his staff. Yeah.
Yeah, and his staff, I mean, which is part of what is now Ministry of Culture. Could you just tell us about your experience working with him? What were the challenges that he was experiencing and that you were helping him with, or you were learning about through his work?
Well, Donny was an amazing guy. First of all, he spoke English very well, which for a person who never went abroad at that time was amazing. But he had a very good background, a very good schooling, very good education. He was the one actually who called the British Museum when the National Museum in Baghdad was being looted. And through his contacts, everything, developed of saving the museum. And after a couple of days, the museum was protected by tanks. Too late, of course. The looting was already over. But it was Donny who did that. And we had a regular contact. when I went to the museum, I had to be, I had a military or a private company convoy with me. But Donny George often went up to the gates of the green zone just by himself and was waiting for me. It was dangerous because you knew the gates were being watched by all kinds of people who wanted to do something to you. But we planned it very carefully. He gave me a call when he was there, and I was standing at the gate. Nobody could see me. Received the call. I said, "I'm here. Where are you?" And he would paint to me where his car was. And then I went through, and then everything went very smoothly. But it was dangerous. So well, we had frequent contact. Seeing that the international community was very upset about the looting and the destruction of the museum, money was flowing in. And Donny was the right person to do so, to handle everything. So he didn't really need my advice. I decided that the libraries were forgotten and that nobody was taking care of the libraries. So I was spending quite a few times at the National Library and the Archives, the INLA, with the Director General and to help them out. Then later on, I got more involved in the protection of archaeological sites and the whole Babylon project, etc. The Deputy Minister of Culture, Dr. Mesoun Tamaluji. Now, she got a degree in architecture in London. And actually, afterwards, she returned to London to become an architect again. We worked very intensively and had very good contact. She was a very kind person. And she confided in me in some of the plans and asked my advice. For example, there were plans to build a new museum in the marshes. She wrote out a competition and she asked me to have a look at the plans. That was during a gathering of all the presentation of those plans, including, where the architects were present. And I noticed that some of the plans were really totally useless. For example, one of the building consisted of aluminum sheetings on the building, just outside, covered with aluminum sheetings. That, in my opinion, in a hot and wet climate, especially in the summer, that just didn't make any sense, because then the inside would become hot again, or would be hot too. So that just doesn't make any sense. Then another plan, which looked pretty okay, but the point was that they imported oak from Norway. Now, everybody knows that if you start building, the best is to use local materials. Now, oak is very well, it's a good material to use in the northern countries of Europe and Central Europe, and in cold climates, but certainly not in hot climate. That will crack, within a couple of months. So, I told them. So that was that was neglected. That was not accepted, that plan. And I also remember I gave a lecture to the architects, probably afterwards, I'm not quite sure. And I told them to make use of local materials as much as possible, and I told them why. And in fact, later, a Canadian architect won the competition. That was in 2005. And if you look at the present museum in the marshes now, it also became not only a museum, but also a research center, which I think is a very good idea, especially to promote traditional knowledge. And if you look at the building, it's built on what we call the idea of green architecture. So a lot of roofs are covered by earth, etc. It's a very interesting project. And it's also integrated in the rehabilitation of the marshes of the area. Because as you know, in order to fight the insurgents or the uprising in the 90s, Saddam just, how do you say that? well, the whole marshes were sort of dammed in and it became very dry. The trick was for the military to get then easily access to the insurgents which were hiding there. So it was a very dry area instead of a, paradise of the confluence of the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. So that was one of the things. And also together with Maysoon, we organized a celebration of the Women's Day. And for that, I went over to the German embassy and got money to do that. And actually, we also organized a fashion show for women wearing scarves. So, she came up with very interesting ideas, and I supported her all the way.
And Maysoon's role exactly, what was her role then?
Well, she belonged to the Iraqi elite. Her brother was the Minister of Housing at the time. But, that was, well, she was also chosen by the CPA at that time to start it, and to put a government together with all the most influential people in Iraq. So there was a lot of clientism going on as well, and according to ethnic religious divisions. Her role was not as strong, of course, because she was a deputy minister, as the minister himself. But I think she did have quite a lot of influence in the policies that were that were written out by the ministry. Besides that, just like in my position, there were no clear rules in division of what to do and what not to do. What your role was in the government or what my role was in the embassy. So you make up the rules yourself and take the space, the room, and the liberties you think you need to work under that circumstances. And in that sense, Maysoon definitely did her best to put up programs and stimulate, stimulate the positive projects for the Ministry of Culture. So I would not underestimate her influence within the Ministry of Culture.
And just another question on working with Donnie George. I mean, he went through a great, a period of stress. He was threatened several times. Do you remember that period?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Tell us a bit about that.
Well, he wasn't afraid really, but at one point it was too much when he received an envelope with a bullet in it. I mean, you also have to see he was Christian, right? So that was not a very popular religion at that time. And his son was threatened, his oldest son. And that was actually when he took the decision to leave the country and go to Damascus, which was for me very unfortunate because we trusted each other. And through him, I also had a better relation with the Ministry of Culture, for example. I knew more or less what was going on at the Ministry of Culture because he was there in many discussions. So he was, for my work, not only personal, but also for my work, a very important person. And actually, the moment that he went, we were very close to finishing a deal with the Americans on the so-called Jewish archives. Now, the Jewish archives, it's actually not archives. There were quite a few manuscripts there as well. Those were found in the cellar of the Mukhabarat, of the Secret Service. Now, most of the Jews were already driven out of Iraq before, especially in the 90s was the last exodus. And there were a couple of Jews left in Baghdad, but they didn't want any contact with anybody. I tried at one particular time, but to no avail. So then the U.S. Civil Affairs unit saw those that particular Jewish archive and decided, after agreement with the then Director General of the SBAH and the government, to transport them to the United States because they were all wet and they started getting molded, and they give them to the National Archive, the NARA in the United States, to be treated. But there was an agreement, and the agreement was only for 1 year. And then we got into trouble because especially the librarian, the general director of the INLA wanted those documents back.
Are we speaking about Saad here, Dr.
Yeah, Saad al-Iskandar, yeah. And the minister agreed with Saad al-Iskandar and said, yeah, well, you know, the period is over, we need them back. And now, to talk about Hebrew manuscripts and anything that was referring to Jews was always very sensitive, not only in Iraq, but definitely outside. At the beginning of the invasion, there was this rumor that Israelis were supporting the coalition forces, some kind of Shrikit units and stuff like that, which in the end wasn't true, actually. Then how do you get these Hebrew, I prefer the word Hebrew, manuscripts and archives back from the United States, where there is such a strong Jewish lobby? Actually, the money for the conservation of the manuscripts was brought up by the Jewish community in the United States, and especially from Washington and New York. So actually, the person I was talking to at the NARA was Jewish herself. So what to do? Then I went to Donny and I said, you know what, why do you need these manuscripts back? I'm not quite sure why I went to Donny George instead of the DG of the INLA, the National Library and Archives. But this is sort of the way it worked. They said, well, we want them back. I said, yeah, okay, why? Why do you want them back? Because it's Iraqi. I said, yeah, but that's not enough. Why do you want them back? Why don't you want copies or something like that? Well, I said, do you have any problems with making copies of it? Digital copies in this case? He said, no, not really. So we just want them back because it's ours. I said, okay. Then later on, I had a tour, which was actually after I left Iraq already. I had a lecture tour in the United States, and I went to the National Archives, spoke to the person who was responsible for that, and I said, you know, the contract is over, you need to return them. This was already a big discussion in the United States. And they said, well, that's going to be difficult. I said, why? Well, you know, we're storing them, blah, blah, blah. Then I said, why do you need them? Well, she said, we need to study them. I said, well, why don't you make digital copies of them and send back the physical manuscripts and archives back where they belong, which is the Iraqi state. Now, you have to realize that the Jewish community, not all of them, but a big part, thinks that every Jewish object, document all over the world belongs to the Jewish people and to the Israeli state. Now, I think differently. We had the same discussion in the Netherlands with the Portuguese synagogue here and the manuscripts that were found, etc. I think that any document, whether religious or not, belongs to the state where it is found or housed. So they are the legal owners, especially, of course, if the community is from the country itself. Now, there is a Jewish Babylon museum. It's called differently in Israel, for example. So that makes the discussion very difficult and complicated. Anyway, I invited her to, but it was difficult to talk to the Americans because they always have lawyers. And in the Netherlands, when you negotiate, you start negotiating informally. We call it, let's have a coffee without anybody present. You know, let's sort of sound each other out and see what you want, and I will tell you what I want, or at least I represent the Iraqi government or the SBEH. And of course, this was all transparent with Donnie George. I mean, I did not represent, of course, the Iraqi state. I just facilitated and mediated. So we had a meeting when I had an ICC Babylon meeting in Berlin. I invited her. She said, well, I cannot come, but she did come. We had breakfast together. Donnie was there too. And I said, well, it's very easy. We thank you very much for restoring and conserving these documents because they needed it very much, definitely. But the SBAH and the MOC, the Ministry of Culture, does agree and has no problem with it to, you know, if you want to make copies of the materials so you can study them. That is definitely not a problem. Then during the process of conservation, the Iraqis would like to be invited to be part of the conservation process and can, you know, follow courses or being taught how to do it properly, so everybody benefits from it. Because there's not much knowledge in Iraq anymore about Jewish or Hebrew manuscripts, etc. They're religious manuscripts, so they need some kind of special conservation. Only think of being kosher, you know. So, and actually we agreed. So I drew up a memorandum of understanding, or one of the other ones, yeah. Send it back to the United States, of course, you know, after Donnie agreed with it. And it came back with some legal issues. It took another month. And just when we were about to close the deal, as the Americans say, Donnie had to flee to Damascus. And that was the end of the story. They only got returned last year. Yeah.
The Jewish archives weren't returned to Iraq. That was what is called the Ba'athist archives.
But
the Jewish archives are still in the US, and sometimes they also
they go on tour. Yeah,
on tour. But can I just ask you about the Jewish archives? What is called the Jewish archives?
Yeah.
What do you think the long-term impact is on Iraq, on the memory of Jewish Hebrew history, if parts of its history and its cultural objects, I know these were the objects, also the items of community members that had left Iraq or forced out of the country, depending on the time period.
Well, it's very clear. I mean, it's part of history. Look at the influence of the Jewish citizens of Babylon of Baghdad on the music and Baghdad music. It's a big influence. So think of Babylon itself. I mean, you know, so the Jewish community at different times in history is important for the history of Iraq, of course. So if part of their history is held outside the country, in a foreign country, it doesn't make sense, and the Iraqis will lose that knowledge. It's specific knowledge, especially if you think of well, you know, the religious traditions and stuff like that. Also, in part of you know, in the light of conservation. So it's a bad thing. But then again, like you said, the Ba'ath archive just returned. That was stolen already in the 90s in the Iran-Iraq war. but also think of the other archives of Makanan. What's his name?
Makia.
Yeah, Makia. And I've seen them too. They're big ledgers from the Mukhabarat, from the Secret Service. I saw the names of all kinds of students, their brothers, their mothers, etc., the whole family, what kind of political affiliation they had. And they were actually photographed in a house which was within the premise of the Green Zone with a digital camera, which is rather amateuristic, I must say. They disappeared too. And
They're the ones in the US. They're the ones in
also,
part in the US, and part of it is in Iraq, and they're the ones that, as far as I know, were at least part or fully returned to Iraq recently.
Okay, so that point, yeah.
The Makia archive, if you like, the ones that he helped spirit out of the country with the support of the US authorities. And,
yes. Well, actually, when I was on my tour, on my lecture tour in the United States, which I referred to earlier, I got invited by a committee in Harvard. I had a lecture in Harvard University. And the committee wanted to know, they got offered, I think these archives, we just, I forgot the name. What's the name again? Makia?
Yeah, Kanan Makia.
Oh yeah, Kanan Makia.
What is called the Ba'athist archives.
Oh yeah. Anyway, so they invited me because they were offered these Kanan Makia archives, the Ba'athist archives, and they wanted my opinion on that. And I said, well, it's very simple. It's not yours. Don't accept them. It's property of the Iraqi state, and they should stay in the Iraqi state. And that was very clear. So we discussed it, and I said, if you will accept them, I'm sure legal measures will be taken. And I would advise the Iraqis to go to the US court because of illegal possession of the state property of a foreign country. That shook them up a little. And they said, thank you very much, Mr. Teijgeler. And they didn't accept them. So later on, I think there was a university in California that did accept them, Stanford, I think. Not quite sure.
Stanford,
yeah. So,
I mean, why do you think the US were interested in all of these archives? I mean, obviously, with the Jewish archives, obviously there's a Jewish community, an Iraqi Jewish community in Europe, in Australia, in the US that are concerned with, let's call them the community archives of their ancestors and grandparents and parents and so on. But why would they be interested in the Ba'athist archives, for instance?
I think not quite sure. I only guess actually. They were interested in the Ba'ath Party, how it came about, in the history of it. The Ba'ath Party not only in Iraq but in general, in other countries as well. I think for historical reasons, and that translated into intelligence. Actually, it's information that could be useful for U.S. intelligence services. I think that is the only reason I could come up with.
Ottoman archives. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Well, it's also a strange name like the Jewish archives, but that's what they're sort of called. The National Library and Archives, the National Archives in this case, had a collection that went back to the Ottoman times, when before 1920s, before the king was installed in Iraq, and that was archives, old books written in Ottoman style. Anyway, they tried to protect that. Much of the collections were saved actually. But other collections, like the newspaper collections and photograph collections, were almost completely destroyed. And one of the collections, the so-called Ottoman archives collections, were stored in the officers' club, were actually a military area in one of the houses at the Officers Club, very famous within in Baghdad, and they were stored in the so-called the school storage of the kitchen, the former kitchen. Now that complex was guarded by I don't know, local guards, and actually the officers or the area where the Officers Club were. Actually, that's where the Americans wanted to build a new library, which, after discussions with Assad, Iskander, we decided it's totally ridiculous, which is another story anyway. But we had somebody called in to give us a report on the physical structure of the library after the plunder and the fires. That was okay. So we decided, you know, it's a recognizable location. So let's stay here and restore the library. Now, the Americans had already set quite a lot of money aside for the new library. So we asked for them, well, we'd rather put it in the building that's already there. And they refused. Very strange. Don't ask me why. Well, anyway, the Ottoman archives were then stored. It was time to get them back. So the DG, the general director, sent some of his people over to that area to get the archives back to the on the premises of the library and National Library and Archives. And then the guards wanted money. They didn't allow them to come in. So, you know, Saad called me and I said, what am I going to do? I said, okay. And this is one of the examples of being a military officer and a cultural advisor at the same time. So I called up the army and I said, I need a platoon. Then at that time, and I want you to do nothing. Just, you know, go with the staff of the library, sit outside, put out your guns and smoke cigarettes. That's all you do. I told them, you know, we wanted to retrieve it and that the guards were making trouble. And that's what happened. So we took them out. Nobody was in our way and got in our way. And we took them out. And then I found out that they were in coolers, although the saying was that they were in freezers, but they were not in freezers. Then again, they were in coolers, but as you know, there are a lot of blackouts and brownouts in Baghdad at the time. So the worst thing that can happen to something that is frozen or cooled, at least as conservation is concerned with objects, is that the temperature drops and then, you know, goes high again and drops and goes high again. So you have to imagine, like, you know, you're pulling at a manuscript and you're pushing it back, and you're pulling and you're pushing it back. So that was the worst circumstances than ever. So we took them out. And meanwhile, I organized a grant of $100,000 from the so-called SERP money. I mean, there are all kinds of funds going around within the army, within the staff, and I don't know. Anyway, I got, and I met several contractors to do the job. My first reaction was to give it to an Iraqi business, but that didn't work because they were giving me money under the table and I didn't accept that. So I went through with an American I trusted, a company. He did a very good job. He took the freezer truck, we put it on the premises of the INLA. We protected it from the outside so that bullets and shells would not enter the freezer truck. We put an how do you say that? Electricity machine. I forgot the word. Generator. Yeah, we put a generator there, and we gave them money for a year of diesel to keep the generator going. And the best is actually minus 22 degrees, and the truck could handle that. I also have everything repacked in acid-free boxes. That was also done, not to make the stacks too high. So what sounded like a perfect project. Until later, I noticed that the director criticized the project because he didn't have the money to continue to pay for the diesel for the generator, which was not my fault.
The
But
the money. I mean, you mentioned SERP, which is the Commander's Emergency Response Program.
true.
I mean, this was money confiscated from the state of Iraq, in part, money that was frozen outside the country, but also US money. It was a combination of the two. And it was obviously stabilization, so short term. And so they wouldn't have money for the kind of things you're speaking about, long term planning and
No,
salaries.
no.
And I guess that became a problem. I mean, that became a problem over time because there was just simply an absence of any kind of planning. The money was within the military itself, the US
Yeah,
military.
yeah. True. Well, later on, because the minister lived for a long time in the Czechoslovak Republic, and he had contacts there. Actually, he was a radio journalist there, and there were contacts with the National Archives in Prague. So later on, I understood, but probably too late actually. The whole Ottoman archives were transferred for conservation to Prague, and then returned, of course.